The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. The Library. The Library of Gormenghast was situated in the castle's eastern wing, which protruded like a narrow peninsula for a distance out of all proportion to the grey hinterland of buildings from which it grew. It was from about midway along this attenuated east wing that the Tower of Flints arose in scarred and lofty sovereignty over all of the towers of Gormenghast. At one time this tower had formed the termination of the eastern wing, but succeeding generations had added to it. On its further side, the additions had begun a tradition and had created the precedent for experiment. For many an ancestor of Lord Groan had given way to an architectural whim and made an incongruous addition. Some of these additions had not even continued the easterly direction in which the original wing had started, for at several points the building veered off into curves, or shot out at right angles before returning to continue the main trend of stone. Most of these buildings had about them the rough-hewn and oppressive weight of masonry that characterized the main volume of Gormenghast, although they varied considerably in every other way, one having at its summit an enormous stone carving of a lion's head, which held between its jaws the limp corpse of a man, on whose body was chiselled the words, "He was an enemy of Groan." Alongside this structure was a rectangular area of some length, entirely filled with pillars set so closely together that it was difficult for a man to squeeze between them. Over them, at the height of about 40 feet, was a perfectly flat roof of stone slabs blanketed with ivy. This structure could never have served any practical purpose, the closely packed forests of pillars with which it was entirely filled being of service only as an excellent place in which to enjoy a fantastic game of hide-and-seek. There were many examples of an eccentric notion translated into architecture in the spine of buildings that spread eastwards over the undulating ground between the heavy walls of conifer, but for the most part they were built with some especial purpose, as a pavilion for entertainments, or as an observatory, or a museum. Some, in the form of halls with galleries around three sides, had been intended for concerts or dancing. One had obviously been an aviary, for though derelict, the branches that had long ago been fastened across the high central hall of the building were hanging by rusty chains, and about the floor were strewn the broken remains of drinking cups for the birds. Wire netting, red with rust, straggled across the floor amongst rank weeds that had taken root. Except for the library, the eastern wing, from the Tower of Flints onwards, was now but a procession of forgotten and desolate relics, an Ichabod of masonry that filed silently along an avenue of dreary pine whose needles hid the sky. The library stood between a building with a grey dome and one with a façade that had once been plastered. Most of the plaster had fallen away, but scraps had remained scattered over the surface, sticking to the stones. Patches of faded colour showed that a fresco had once covered the entire face of the building. Neither doors nor windows broke the stone surface. On one of the larger pieces of plaster that had braved 100 storms and still clung to the stone, it was possible to make out the lower part of a face, but nothing else was recognizable among the fragments. The library, though a lower building than these two to which it was joined at either end, was of a far greater length than either. The track that ran along the eastern wing, now in the forest and now within a few feet of the kaleidoscopic wall shadowed by the branches of the evergreens, ended as it curved suddenly inwards towards the carved door. Here it ceased among the nettles at the top of the 3 deep steps that led down to the less imposing of the 2 entrances to the library, but the one through which Lord Sepulchrave always entered his realm. It was not possible for him to visit his library as often as he wished, for the calls made upon him by the endless ceremonials which were his exacting duty to perform robbed him of many hours each day of his only pleasure, books. Despite his duties, It was Lord Sepulchrave's habit to resort each evening, however late the hour, to his retreat, and to remain there until the small hours of the following day. The evening on which he sent Flay to have Titus brought to him found Lord Sepulchrave free at 7 in the evening, and sitting in the corner of his library, sunk in a deep reverie. The room was lit by a chandelier whose light, unable to reach the extremities of the room, lit only the spines of those volumes on the central shelves of the long walls. A stone gallery ran around the library at about 15 feet above the floor, and the books that lined the walls of the main hall 15 feet below were continued upon the high shelves of the gallery. In the middle of the room, immediately under the light, stood a long table. It was carved from a single piece of the blackest marble, which reflected upon its surface 3 of the rarest volumes in his lordship's collection. Upon his knees, drawn up together, was balanced a book of his grandfather's essays, but it had remained unopened. His arms lay limply at his side, and his head rested against the velvet of the chair-back. He was dressed in the grey habit which it was his custom to wear in the library. From full sleeves his sensitive hands emerged with the shadowy transparency of alabaster. For an hour he had remained thus. The deepest melancholy manifested itself in every line of his body. The library appeared to spread outwards from him as from a core. His dejection infected the air about him and infused its illness upon every side. All things in the long room absorbed his melancholia. The shadowing galleries brooded with low anguish. The books receding into the deep corners, tier upon tier, seemed each a separate tragic note in a monumental fugue of volumes. It was only on those occasions now, when the ritual of Gormenghast dictated, that he saw the Countess. They had never found in each other's company a sympathy of mind or body, and their marriage, necessary as it was from the lineal standpoint, had never been happy. In spite of his intellect, which he knew to be far and away above hers, he felt and was suspicious of the heavy, forceful vitality of his wife. Not so much a physical vitality as a blind passion for aspects of life in which he could find no cause for interest. Their love had been passionless, and save for the knowledge that a male heir to the house of Groan was imperative, they would have gladly forgone their embarrassing yet fertile union. During her pregnancy he had only seen her at long intervals. No doubt the unsatisfactory marriage had added to his native depression, but compared with the dull forest of his inherent melancholy, it was but a tree from a foreign region that had been transplanted and absorbed. It was never this estrangement that grieved him, nor anything tangible, but a constant and indigenous sorrow. Of companions with whom he could talk upon the level of his own thoughts there were few, and of these only one gave him any satisfaction, the poet. On occasion he would visit that long, wedge-headed man, and find in the abstract language with which they communicated their dizzy stratas of conjecture a temporary stir of interest. But in the poet there was an element of the idealist, a certain enthusiasm which was a source of irritation to Lord Sepulchrave, so that they met only at long intervals. The many duties which to another might have become irksome and appeared fatuous were but to his lordship a relief and a relative escape from himself. He knew that he was past all hope a victim of chronic melancholia, and were he to have had each day to himself, he would have had to resort constantly to those drugs that even now were undermining his constitution. This evening, as he sat silently in the velvet-backed chair, his mind had turned to many subjects like a black craft, that, though it steers through many waters, has always beneath it a deathly image reflected among the waves. Philosophers and the poetry of death, the meaning of the stars and the nature of these dreams that haunted him when in those chloral hours before the dawn the laudanum built for him within his skull a tallow-coloured world of ghastly beauty. He had brooded long, and was about to take a candle that stood ready on a table at his elbow and search for a book more in keeping with his mood than were the essays on his knee, when he felt the presence of another thought that had been tempering his former cogitations, but which now stood boldly in his mind. It had begun to make itself felt as something that clouded and disturbed the clarity of his reflections when he had pondered on the purpose and significance of tradition and ancestry, and now with the thought detached from its erudite encumbrances, he watched it advance across his brain and appear naked, as when he had first seen his son, Titus. His depression did not lift, it only moved a little to one side. He rose to his feet, and moving without a sound, replaced the book in a shelf of essays. He returned as silently to the table. "Where are you?" he said. Flay appeared at once from the darkness of one of the corners. "What hour is it?" Flay brought out his heavy watch. "8, your lordship." Lord Sepulchrave, with his head hanging forward on his breast, walked up and down the length of the library for a few minutes. Flay watched him as he moved, until his master stopped opposite his servant. "I wish to have my son brought to me by his nurse. I shall expect them at 9. You will conduct them through the woods. You may go." Flay turned, and accompanied by the reports of his knee joints, disappeared into the shadows of the room. Pulling back the curtain from before the door at the far end, he unlatched the heavy oak and climbed the 3 steps into the night. Above him the great branches of the pines rubbed against one another and grated in his ears. The sky was overcast, and had he not made this same journey through the darkness 1,000 times, he must surely have lost himself in the night. To his right he could sense the spine of the western wing, although he could not see it. He walked on, and in his mind he said, "Why now? Why now? Thought he'd forgotten him. Should have seen the child long ago. What's the game? Heir to Gormenghast to come through woods on cold night? Wrong. Dangerous. Catch a cold. But lordship knows. He knows. I am only his servant. First servant. No one else that. Chose me. Me! Flay, because he trusts me. Well may he trust me. And why? They wonder. Silent as a corpse. That's why. As he neared the Tower of Flints, the trees thinned and a few stars appeared in the blackness above him. By the time the body of the castle was reached, only half the sky was hidden by the night clouds, and he could make out vague shapes in the darkness. Suddenly he stopped, his heart attacking his ribs, and drew up his shoulders to his ears. But a moment later he realized that the vague, obese patch of blackness a few feet from him was a shrub of clipped box, and not that figure of evil who now obsessed him. He straddled onwards, and came at last to an entrance beneath the sweep of an archway. Why he did not enter it at once and climb the stairs to find Nanny Slag he did not know. That he could see through the archway and across the darkness of the servants' quadrangle a dim light in a high window of one of the kitchen buildings was in itself nothing unusual. There was generally a light showing somewhere in the kitchen quarters, although most of the staff would have resorted to their underground dormitories by that time of night. An apprentice, given some fatigue duty to perform after his normal hours, might be scrubbing a floor, or a special dish for the morrow might necessitate a few cooks working late into the evening. Tonight, however, a dull greenish light from a small window held his eye, and before he realized that he was even intrigued, he found that his feet had forestalled his brain and were carrying him across the quadrangle. On his way across he stopped twice to tell himself that it was a pointless excursion, and that he was in any case feeling extremely cold, but he went on nevertheless with an illogical and inquisitive itch overriding his better judgment. He could not tell which room it was that gave forth this square greenish glow. There was something unhealthy about its colour. No one was about in the quadrangle. There were no other footsteps but his own. The window was too high for even him to peer into, although he could easily reach it with his hands. Once again he said to himself, "What are you doing? Wasting your time. Told me lordship to fetch Nanny Slag and child. Why are you here? What are you doing?" But again his thin body had anticipated him, and he had begun to roll away an empty cask from against the cloister walls. In the darkness it was no easy matter to steer the barrel and to keep it balanced upon the tilted rim as he rolled it towards the square of light, but he managed with very little sound to bring it immediately under the window. He straightened his back and turned his face up to the light that escaped like a kind of gas and hovered about the window in a haze of the autumn night. He had lifted his right foot onto the barrel, but realized that to raise himself into the centre of the window would cause his face to catch the light from the room. Why, he did not know, but the curiosity which he had felt beneath the low arch was now so intense that after lowering his foot and pulling the barrel to the right of the small window, he scrambled upon it with a haste that startled him. His arms were outstretched on either side along the viewless walls, and his fingers, spread out like the ribs of a bone fan, began to sweat as he moved his head gradually to the left. He could already see through the glass, in spite of a sweep of old cobwebs like a fly-filled hammock, the smooth stone walls of the room beneath him, but he had still to move his head further into the light in order to obtain a clear view of the floor of the room. The light that seeped in a dull haze through the window dragged out as from a black canvas the main bone formations of Mr. Flay's head, leaving the eye sockets, the hair, the area beneath the nose and lower lip, and everything that lay beneath the chin, as part of the night itself. It was a mask that hung in the darkness. Mr. Flay moved it upwards inch by inch until he saw what he had by some prophetic qualm known all along that it was his destiny to see. In the room below him the air was filled with an intensification of that ghastly green which he had noticed from across the quadrangle. The lamp that hung from the centre of the room by a chain was enclosed in a bowl of lime-green glass. The ghoulish light which it spewed forth gave to every object in the room a theatrical significance. But Flay had no eyes for the few scattered objects in the nightmare before him, but only for an enormous and sinister presence, the sight of which had caused him to sicken and sway upon the cask, and to remove his head from the window while he cooled his brow on the cold stones of the wall.